All right, Angela, thanks for getting us started.
Absolutely. My name's Angela. I'm with Campaign Nonviolence. I will be hosting today's Q&A with Michael Nagler, who is the founder and president of Meta Center for Nonviolence. He co-founded the Peace and Conflict Studies program at UC Berkeley, where he was Professor Emeritus of Classics and Comparative Literature. Today we'll be discussing the Nonviolence Handbook, using examples from history. Michael Nagler's Nonviolence Handbook provides a blueprint for effective action for change against oppression and injustice. The principles introduced are clear and concisely illustrated using past successes and failures. Some of those failures even wound up leading to successes later. This short, easy-to-read book is packed with crucial guidelines, warnings, and concepts, including satyagraha, I don't say that word always properly, the power and passion to take on suffering at the hands of the oppressor. This is a must-read for anybody interested in knowing how to use the methods of nonviolence to achieve social change. And I have a few questions, about 5 questions. I'm going to go ahead and pause it to Michael, and then we can go ahead and open them up for additional questions as they come in. Michael, it's just an honor to be online with you doing this meeting. My first question is, why is it important to avoid labeling an oppressor who likes the label? For example, Nazi or KKK.
My first question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Because I switched microphones and I wasn't sure this was one. Yeah, well, the basic problem with labels is they form a kind of screen in between us and the other person as a human being. And that is the beginning of all violence. And I assume we're all familiar with that model of Barbara Deming's, which Ken Budigan likes to use a lot, and we've got in our film, where he says, you know, the two hands of nonviolence are, I will not put up with your injustice, but I'm open to you as a human being. Now, we know that in order to recognize another person as fully human, you have to see them as an individual. Now, I don't know if you're all familiar with this incredible experiment that was done at Princeton. You know, the fact is, if you show someone on the screen a picture of someone from a different race, that part of the brain that puts you into fight or flight is activated. So these two women at Princeton didn't like this any more than I do or you do. They wanted to see if there's a way around it, and they tricked the experiment a little bit by, before the person was shown the face, they were asked a very silly sounding question like, does this person like coffee or tea? Or does this person like crunchy peanut butter or smooth peanut butter? And by golly, it almost totally suppressed that reaction from the limbic system. So it was a good kind of physical illustration of the power of humanizing another person, and conversely, the results of dehumanizing them. And that's what a label does. If I put any kind of label on you, I'm no longer seeing you as a person. So it doesn't matter whether you like it or don't like it. I've created a screen between us, and then nonviolence is not going to be able to operate.
Thank you. Given the events in Charlottesville, were there any lessons we could learn to use for future confrontations with the alt-right? Are there any strategies one can use to turn an oppressor into an ally?
Well, there always are strategies to turn an oppressor into an ally. As I was mentioning before we started the call formally, we're going to be playing a conversation that tried to do exactly this tomorrow on our radio program. But that's an extreme case because someone who is a white supremacist of whatever stripe is a very hurting, very alienated person, and it's going to be extremely difficult to reach them, but it can be done. I don't know if you're familiar with this incredible episode that happened with Meta peace teams, and that's Meta with one T. And David, you probably know about this. This was in 1998. There was a Klan rally in Ann Arbor, and make a long story short, there was a guy at the rally who took his jacket off and his whole body was tattooed with swastikas and hate messages. And people from the crowd jumped him, and they actually, someone broke a bottle over his head. He fell to the ground. Immediately, the peace team rushed in and protected him, and then got him up on his feet and started walking him over to the sidewalk to get into an ambulance or a car, as it turned out. And just before they put him in the car, someone said to him, I just want you to know that a lesbian, a gay man, and a queer Jew just saved your life today. And he was, of course, pretty stunned, and he couldn't speak at that time. He was too injured, but his girlfriend was there, and she was deeply, deeply moved. And she said, I've hated you people all my life, but maybe we have the same blood running in our veins after all. So those people can be reached. It's difficult to create an environment in which they will be reached. But to go back, Angela, to the early part of your question, I think what Charlottesville says is that we should try to avoid these confrontations, if at all possible. And I don't know if you saw the article that mentioned us. It was in the New York Times last Sunday, an article by Moises Velasquez Manoff. We told him about this episode in Germany, in a little town called Wunsiedel, a few years ago, where the neo-Nazis were marching every year from the railroad station to the cemetery because Rudolf Hess was buried there. And even though the townspeople disinterred the guy and got him out of the town, they were still marching to that gravesite. So this particular year, what they did was they made marked stripes across the road. And for every stripe that the Nazi marchers passed, they would contribute more money to an organization called Exit Deutschland, which is an organization that helps people get out of the neo-Nazi movement. So these poor people, they were completely befuddled. The more they marched, the more they were contributing money to a cause that is injurious to them. And then when they reached the cemetery, the crowd just went wild and showered them with flower petals, because they had, by then, they had racked up 15,000 euros. So I think, to treat it with a little bit of humor and not get sucked in, which is exactly what Antifas do. They, adopting violence, which is the method of the violent, they get sucked in and just simply escalate. And unless we have very, very well-trained peace teams ready to go in and de-escalate the conflict, and unless we have some kind of humorous thing that we prepared ahead of time, I actually believe we should simply stay away from those things, and not give them the publicity that they thrive on.
Absolutely. I for some reason I'm coming up with those empathy tents. I don't know if you think that it's a good tool as well, but I was really moved by some of the things that were going on over in Berkeley with the empathy tents. I thought that was a fabulous idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've known Ed for many years. He gave me my first television interview many years ago. And I'm real happy about the empathy tent. It's not my field. My field is nonviolent strategy and campaigns and movements, but a little empathy would never hurt in this situation, in this day and age.
So in going back to some other movements, at the end of the day, how important do you think the Occupy Wall Street movement was to the overall nonviolent movement?
Well, I can't remember whether I mentioned it in the book or not. I think Occupy, I have mixed feelings about it. Okay, it was, yes, Sarah, I see your note that there's lots of background noise. I'm hearing some of it too, and I don't know what to do about it. Everybody's muted except me. So back to the question, it certainly injected a new note into the discourse. Nobody was speaking up. Nobody had any idea how powerful a feeling was developing among ordinary people. So they displayed that. And if you're familiar with my model, it's in the book here somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, page, got to put my glasses on, Angela. Page 23, I talk about this model of the escalation curve, if you all can see that. And I divide conflicts into 3 stages. And in the earliest stage, folks are willing to speak to one another. They have not dehumanized one another very deeply. And at that stage, it's perfectly appropriate to have protest rallies, to submit petitions, and so forth. But there comes a time when the other side is not really interested in what you want. They know what you want and they don't care. So at that point, you've got to move into satyagraha. And with the enormous outpouring of protest in the run-up to the Iraq War in 1993, and with Occupy, we saw kind of the same mistake. People are ready to do the first stage, and you should. You want to do your protest and do your petitioning first. Give the opponent the benefit of the doubt that maybe they'll respond. But you know perfectly well, they're not going to respond. So when the president back then said, I don't have to pay attention to these people, they're just a focus group, he was signaling to us that it's time to go into stage 2, if not further. And we weren't ready to do that. We didn't have the organization, we didn't have the techniques, we didn't have the understanding, which is why I wrote the book. So I think Occupy made a number of mistakes, and I hope we can recover from them. I think, the leaderlessness and some other things I don't want to necessarily go into deprive them of a lot of efficacy, of a lot of power. So some people were there and they caught on and they're moving on and doing bigger and better things. So you can see, I say it's kind of a mixed message. They did some good, but given the amount of energy that was poured into it, it could have been much more effective.
So I have about 2 more questions and then we'll open it up. In terms of explaining satyagraha with others who don't know, can you explain the difference between satyagraha, I never quite say the word right, and passiveness? How would you define that more precisely?
Yeah, well, I'm eager to get to the chat questions. I just see Rivera put a really good one up. Satyagraha is intensely active. I'm kind of paraphrasing Martin Luther King here, but you're not necessarily at first acting with your body. You're doing what we call today subtle activism. By converting anger and fear that you feel toward the opponent into a constructive action, you're actually causing a tremendous change, which is going to be reverberating in the system. So satyagraha is never passive. And it is easy to confuse them if you don't know anything. And this, caused Gandhi to tear his hair out and me to tear my hair out, as you can see. And I don't know exactly how to say more, but satyagraha is those two hands. It's saying, I will not put up with your injustice. I'm willing to suffer, to, to resist it, but I'm open to you as a human being. That is an extremely active posture.
Michael. Last question, and then we'll open it up.
Okay.
In applying the new story and in light of our current circumstances, do you see constructive program as more effective than resistance actions or personal power? Or what priority do you put the three foundations of personal power, resistance, and constructive program?
Right, good question. Well, I'm not very much of an either or man when it comes to things like this. I think each of them is important in its place. The timing is extremely important. If you go right into resistance without having tried to reach your opponent and without having tried to uh, fix the situation yourself, you're in the wrong timing and it's not going to work very well. But once you've done constructive program and you've pushed it to the point where you expect that what you've been building will take off, and then you get resistance, you get pushback from the opponent, then to just keep on doing constructive program would be a mistake. You've got to be ready to move to resistance at that point. So I'm very confident that those three things are equally necessary in their place. You look even more Muslim now.
I was having a little bit of a clumsy fashion moment.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you. So it's open now to whatever questions come to mind in review of the material and in light of the conversations that have taken place. Does anyone else have some questions for Michael or some insights that they wanted to bring up?
I know that there are 5 chat messages there. Are you looking at those, Angela, or Ryan? Are you monitoring that?
Yeah, that's just some discussion about background noise, but I think Rivera has a question we'll start with.
Okay.
Yeah. You were speaking about the escalation curve, which appears in the book, and this is a question that comes out of the pages of the book and maybe into your experience. What might be some thoughts that you could share on how to get people to be proactive versus reactive?
Wow. What a good question. I think people almost right off the cuff respond to that as a value, as a desideratum. If you say to them, you're being reactive only, and you should also be being proactive, I think a lot of people would say, that sounds right, but they don't necessarily know how to be proactive. And sometimes when you say, shouldn't you be building schools and creating co-ops and things like that, they think you want them to give up activism. And that's that thing that often makes them nervous. So I think you have to be able to provide an example of what proactivity would look like in this situation, and maybe explain a little bit more fully why being proactive is so much more important and so much more powerful than being reactive. Know that you're letting them determine the script instead of taking charge of it yourself. If you look at anything successful that Gandhi did or Martin Luther King did, you'll almost always find that they picked up the baton first. As in the Northwest Frontier Province, as it was called then, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, he started his career by building schools. And then the British authorities called him in for a talk and told him he had to stop doing that. They're in charge, not him. He couldn't build schools. Well, that made the British look ridiculous. It showed that they were not in Afghanistan or in the Northwest frontier to help the Pashtuns. They were there to strangle them and keep their stranglehold on. So you see all of these advantages that accrued from starting in a non-threatening, positive posture. So, have examples on hand, be able to explain theoretically why proactivity is so much more powerful, and then give them a concrete example of how they can do it in that situation. And if they still don't do it, well, you've done your best. I don't think there's much more you can do. Good.
Right. Looks like we've got Stephanie Joe. Hi, Stephanie.
Hello. Yeah, so I guess I'm kind of piggybacking on Revera's question because, you hear me okay?
Yeah, I was hearing you, Stephanie, yeah.
Okay, I heard something that sounded like someone was asking, okay, so I live in Western Massachusetts, and a couple weeks ago, I went to the march in Boston, which was the response to Charlottesville. And yeah, I mean, the story of the whole thing is like, its own story. But in terms of people going there, it was so emotion driven. And people were so unprepared if something happened. Even though, I went with a group that ostensibly received some training. And I've been studying and doing training and figuring out, where can I fit and do what I can do. We didn't have the first level order of discipline. As a group, as a supposed affinity group, we couldn't even stay together for the march. I mean, luckily nothing happened and we weren't required, to do anything. But if we had been, it would have been a disaster. And I was hyper aware of that the entire time. And I thought, all these other, situations that people are going into, they're really, it seems to me, very emotion driven, and there isn't tactic, there isn't strategy. And so I sent some feedback to the people that I went with, with these observations, and they said, yeah, that it was really, they experienced it as kind of a wake-up call as to how unprepared we are. So maybe there's some steps, that'll start to happen, for people, who are trying to tap in, who know that we need to do more. But it feels so belated. And there's so much just sheer emotion. I mean, people are, reacting from, that's it. They're just reacting. And I don't know, maybe there's no way to accelerate people's reaction to the point that they start to become more thoughtful and more strategic. But if you have tipping point ideas or, leverage or, any response to that?
Yeah, my response to that is to resonate and empathize, Stephanie. This is an ongoing problem. And back when Bernie Sanders, you remember him and that, when he had so much incredible enthusiasm and hope among the young people, I was concerned that I was fairly sure he wouldn't get the nomination, given the way that our system is set up. And I was really concerned that those kids would go through a tremendous letdown And in many cases, it turned to anger. And so we did one of these black and white animations, encouraging them to get into some kind of constructive action now while they still had that tide of positive enthusiasm going. And I remember when King was challenged about, causing outbursts of anger, he said, no, that's not what we did. We harnessed anger under discipline for maximum effect. So what we're seeing over and over again is the raw material, but it's not being developed. And I think if we were there in Boston with some simple suggestions of what people could do next, and just went around with a clipboard and said, this is great, but now would you sign on to join this and do that? We probably would have captured a lot of that energy and a lot of that enthusiasm. But really, it saddens me to see all of that energy just kind of be blowing off steam. One of the things that's really just disheartening about it is whenever we do something like that, the opposition says, well, that's all they can do. We don't have to march around waving signs. We're passing laws and getting people shot, and we've got our machinery rolling. And whenever we march around and show signs and then go back home having accomplished nothing, we're telling them, in effect, that we are incapacitated. There's nothing we can do. So it's more than just a waste of time. It's actually, to some degree, it's counterproductive. And yeah, I think if folks like us would do some creative thinking and come up with some concrete alternatives that people could launch right into, I'm just plucking this out of the air because we've been working at the Meta Center on a project to get all the schools in our town, Petaluma schools, to adopt restorative justice. And we're kind of explaining that if we get restorative justice to be the norm in America's schools, we could move on from there to the prison system. And we can, the sky's the limit to where we could carry it from there. But if I had been there in Boston, I think I would have had a sign-up sheet for people who want to work on restorative justice and a couple of points to explain why I think this is going to carry us forward, why I think it's a good strategy. Yeah, I think in doing that, we could get people to use some of that energy, so they're not just frustrated when no one pays attention. Yeah, and as far as the other part of what you were saying, Stephanie, about how you weren't really prepared in case trouble had developed. Well, again, that's serious. It's almost better not to be there than to be there and expose yourself to a letdown, a failure of that kind. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Mike.
Rivera has something else to add.
Oh, Rivera, go ahead.
Oh, I was just putting in the chat column that some communities like Portland, Oregon, and what the Portland Peace teams are doing have really stepped up to offer monthly or quarterly trainings and to do outreach to specific interest groups. Like I knew in Detroit, I believe, the Meta Peace team has done that with incoming freshman classes in colleges. So I think there's a lot that we can be doing proactively to skill up our local populace, so to speak.
Yeah, that's very true, Rivera. I think, I've been saying for some time that the two big dimensions that are missing, I just noticed your t-shirt. What fun. That's one of our shirts, isn't it? Ta-da. Sorry for the interruption. So I've been saying for a long time that the two big dimensions that are missing to really take us forward constructively are training and strategy. And training is happening. Yeah, training is happening. We could do with more of it, but we've got more than just a little, and it's moving on, and it's extremely encouraging and makes a big difference. So the next piece that we should be working on, and Ryan has heard me say this for some years now, so I hope it's not too boring, Ryan, is some sense of strategy, some trajectory that we go from a win and that we can fairly easily do, that we can predict we probably will win at this thing, and then move on from there.
I have a question.
Okay.
So one of the things that came up is in from the Charlottesville event was taking down statues, which is the way I saw that it's important from a symbolic standpoint. But I feel like there's going to be more of a backlash. Again, the people that empower, to those that are oppressed, it feels like a win. But in the long-term strategy, I feel like there's going to be more of a blowback from that, and that we didn't actually accomplish some of the structural and foundational issues of othering and the inherent, our system, our actual foundation. And so until we start really looking at our laws and our system and the foundation, I feel like that's a very short victory. And it doesn't really do what we want it to do. And I would love to see more things like interfaith compassion circles around the White House, things like that actually invite people instead of calcify the opposition. And I just sort of wanted to bring it up since we are talking about strategy and long-term thinking and how we go about, at the very least, not getting into this othering polarization that keeps us so divided. I just wanted to know your insight.
Yeah, I had a couple of problems with the taking down of statues, and some of my problems with that are a little bit controversial. Stephanie Van Hook almost shut me down when I was trying to get into this on our radio program. The first that I'll mention is pretty much what you were saying, Angela. This is a symbol. And in nonviolent action, as we have come to know it, I think we spend way too much time on symbolism and don't back it up with concrete changes. In fact, I think I have a chapter on that in the book. So that's one thing. Second thing is, it doesn't address the issue of regional pride. Now, the fact is that the South was humiliated in two ways by the Civil War. First, they were told that they were morally inferior, which is extremely humiliating. And then they were crushed militarily, and they burned Atlanta unnecessarily. So the South was humiliated. In fact, that's a big part of the motivation behind Nazi Germany and the recent neo-Nazis. They were humiliated by, in World War I, first of all, losing. Militarists hate that. But second of all, being told that they were barbarians and they didn't measure up morally to the rest of Europe. Stinging insults. And nobody ever addressed that. So nobody was willing to think about the fact that when you tear down the statues of these people in whom the South has some pride, rightly or wrongly, it's the Civil War all over again. You're humiliating them again. So my proposal, which nobody listened to, was put up a statue of some great Southerners that they can be proud of that did things that are not morally problematic, like, great writers. Think of that, Faulkner. Who was it who wrote A Good Man? Flannery O'Connor. So many great Southerners. Put up one of those statues and then take down Robert E. Lee. So that was my plan, which again, went unheeded, like most of my plans do. But I had another thought about this, and that is that all war memorials should come down. So instead of going in there and just taking down Robert E. Lee, take down all the statues that we have in northern cities where there's this guy riding on a horse with a sword and all these inferiors are crushed under the hooves. And, you know, take them down and put up some really effective pro-peace statues in their place. And I don't think the one at the UN is really all that great with the twisted up pistol. But, you know, be that as it may, I think if our posture was that we're against violence, instead of we're against Southern violence, I think it would go down, even though we're still on the symbolic level, it would go down much better and would not lead to that kickback that you're talking about.
Thanks, Michael. I wanted to turn it over to David Hartso, who had a question.
Right. Hi, David.
Hi, Michael. Thanks very much for your presentation today and also all you do. And I want to recommend to everyone the New York Times article that you're quoted in from last Sunday, which I think is very helpful. Yeah. This is a continuation of some of the other comments, but it seems to me we're at a very key moment in the United States where Antifa folks are saying, we have the way to try to deal with these hate people, with the Nazis and the neo-fascists, etc. And I was kind of surprised yesterday in Democracy Now! They interviewed a person that was saying that the Antifa folks were in Houston helping deal with the people that are suffering from the floods there.
Wow.
That's their constructive program.
Yep.
And it seems to me we're at a key moment where people across the country really are looking, we have a choice. Do we join the Antifa folks and say violence is the only way to do it? Or is there another way to really create a society where we're not hating people and not doing this? And it just seems to me there's a need for an initiative from people committed to nonviolence to really get that out there to the whole society, that there is a viable, powerful, strong choice. And we saw this during the civil rights movement, where instead of responding violently, people just kept lining up to vote and getting beaten up and the fire hoses, etc. And obviously Cornel West saying, well, these Antifa folks, I didn't agree with them, but they saved my life. I'd just like to hear more of your thoughts, and maybe others that are on the call, how people in the nonviolent movement can really take the initiative at this point.
Yeah. Well, I agree with everything you said, David. And by the way, I do like the beard. It's a good innovation. Anyway, back to the topic. I agree with everything you said, and I wanted to add something. That in addition to being a critical moment, it might be a learning opportunity. If we could reach people and explain to them that the energy that you are deploying is the same as the energy that you are against. In fact, that was the one thing that I said that was quoted verbatim in the New York Times article. And by the way, I think it was Stephanie Joe wanted to know that the article is called, and the title was terrible. I brought it up to the writer and he said, it's not my fault. We don't get to choose our own titles. But the title was How to Make Fun of Neo-Nazis, or How to Make Fun of Nazis. That was a terrible idea. Anyway, if we could reach people to open their eyes to understand that there are non-physical forces in this universe. And the most important thing to know about those forces is that by and large, they're either violent or nonviolent. You know, they're either going to promote hate or love. And when you're using hate against haters, you're simply reinforcing the energy, the belief system that they've gone in with. So the first step would be, I'm not going to use the kind of energy that I object to create a resolution, because as Angela would say, in the long term, you'll just be adding to the problem. So that would then open people up, and we could go in with these creative alternatives and say, here's how you can do it by using an entirely different energy. So I guess the kinds of things that I'm always thinking about are, one, what kind of subtle energy is engaged by what I'm doing right now? And two, can I connect the dots between what I'm doing now and some result down the road? Because the other problem of the Antifa people is that they want to see the concrete result right away. If they can't see that, they will write it off. It's a complete failure. So the more we can point out that when nonviolent things happened, there was a much better resolution down the road, and show the connection. I get the one that pops into my head is Prague Spring, in 1968, 69. It completely failed to rescue the reforms that the Czechs were trying to get past the Kremlin. It failed to do that. But because they had all operated nonviolently, it was a kind of conspicuous example of that. When the Iron Curtain fell, 20 some years later, they were ready to mobilize and use nonviolence. And if you put all the countries of Eastern Europe on a spectrum, where Romania was the most violent, I would say Czechoslovakia was the least violent. It saved them a lot of grief, and it positioned them to build a more democratic society. Because Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, in their book, they've shown that if you have a nonviolent uprising, 5 years down the road, you're 10 times more likely to have a more democratic society, and 4 times more likely to have a more democratic society, even if you fail. Even if the Milosevic or whoever is still in power, the fact that you acted nonviolently produced a nonviolent wave, if you will, in the minds and hearts of people that is bound to have a good result somewhere down the line. So what am I saying? And I'm coming up with this part now just off the top of my head. I think if we had some simple ways of explaining this, which is very subtle. I mean, we all understand it, but it's a kind of subtlety that people who are terrified or full of hatred can't grasp. So if we had some simple way of describing this, like a really simple image and some simple language, and if we went around using it consistently, I think we could open people's minds and hearts to the real problem with Antifa. And we wouldn't have to say, we hate what you're doing, but you could be doing this in a much more effective way in the long term. I'm sorry, that was a longish answer.
Thank you. And I think you meant dealing with Antifa, not Occupy at the very end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Did I say Occupy? Didn't need to.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Michael. Just a quick heads up, we've got 2 people with their hands raised. If you have a question and you want to ask Michael something, go ahead and press that raise hand on the bottom of your screen. Or if you're on video, just wave at us and we can unmute you. So I'm going to call on Miles now. Hi, Miles.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I think your audio is going in and out.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now you're okay.
Okay, it just so happened somebody was telephoning me. It looks like. First of all, just to give my recognition and appreciation for all the people, including Mr. Nagler today, who have the skill and capacity and patience to write these books. Now, on to, and I'm looking forward to getting all of the books eventually. With respect to the simple language, one of the things that concerns me is Einstein said, if we're going to survive, we have to change our way of thinking. And when I think of those words, for the last couple of years, I've been mulling over, well, how do we change our thinking? What do we change our thinking to? And then I came across Rivera, and I've come across Bene, and it's all starting to connect the dots for me. And Gandhi was very, very much inspired by the Bible. And at the end of the day, the story of the Bible, if it's read correctly, in my opinion, is just simply it's the story of Jesus Christ, who said he is the way, the truth, and the life. So what we have is an economy where corporations have their visions and values, but I have yet to find a corporation that says, you know, their vision is to be the way of peace, to be, you know, unconditionally truthful, for unconditional life. I live in Calgary, and we're choking on smoke. It's an oil capital of Canada, and Houston is an oil capital of the United States, and they're flooding. So, you know, this climate change is here and now. We've had smoke from fires in British Columbia for the last 2 months almost. So my question, Mr. Nagler, is what would I find in your handbook to assist a person who's in a corporation and is trying to work from the inside to change their mission and values?
Oh, that is a good question. And before I answer it directly, Miles, there are some corporations that are, as best as they can, adopting the kind of values that we're talking about, even in their business strategies. And in fact, the publisher of this little handbook, Barrett Kohler, has just become what they call a benefit corporation. Because in many dimensions, they are trying to get away from the oppressive culture that a money-first corporation generates. So there are some examples, and that's good to know. And I would approach them and talk about those examples, like the Mondragon cooperatives in northern Spain, because those corporations are actually doing well. You know, they say do good, do well by doing good. It is actually happening, and that's counterintuitive. So that gives us an opening to explain what Angela was referring to before as the new story, that science and spirituality are now coming together to paint an entirely different picture, well, of the universe and of human beings. Like, who are we? We are not physical entities only that are doomed to compete with one another for external resources. We're much deeper than that. And you can use the shock value of something that's counterintuitive, like the fact that Barrett Kohler and Mondragon and many other corporations I might mention are actually doing well financially. Just as there's a former football coach in Maryland who absolutely refused to go along with the machismo of football. And you might think, you know, take away the machismo and what have you got left? But he would, when his boys came out on the field, he would say, "What is my job?" And they would yell back, "To love us." And they would say, "And what is your job?" And they'd say, "To love one another." And they did all of this stuff, and they played well to excel, but not to beat. And again, counterintuitively, they were first in their league many times. They played really excellent football and won a lot of matches as far as that goes. So using examples like that might create an opening. And within that opening, you can explain this new model of humanity that's trying to emerge, and the fact that nonviolence fits into it, and so forth. Actually, funny you should mention that, Miles, because next month we're going down to Google. Meta invades Google. So it'll be very interesting to see if I follow my own advice and if it works. But wish me luck. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for your question, Miles, too. We have about 5 more minutes. I think Stephanie Joe had another question. Stephanie?
We don't have to go here. If someone else wants to go somewhere else or wrap up on a different thing, but I'm just thinking about the Antifa and our approach to them. I mean, I was struck, Michael, by what you said about the parallels, in shaming Southerners, with the conditions that created Nazi Germany. And I really appreciated your suggestions for how to, creative ideas for how to address that a little bit differently. It's not quite the same thing, but I think that we're really positioning ourselves, as morally superior to the Antifa in a way that I don't think is really going to help us persuade them. And I wonder if some distinctions might be useful. For instance, the people in Charlottesville really appreciated being protected. Mm-hmm. And I don't know to what extent that's a role that we want to advocate or support or anything like that. But I think there is a distinction to be made between a defensive action for people who have not chosen to be in that situation versus people who commit to a nonviolent approach, know what it is they're getting into, go into that situation, with all of that knowledge. I mean, in those situations, yeah, we don't want the Antifa there doing their thing, at least not in a provocative, violent way. And they should, I don't know, go along with the nonviolent precept of the event. But I think there is a difference. And I think that if we could maybe honor that in some way, that also is going to be a much more effective way to bring them kind of on board in those situations where we really need them not to give the media, the ridiculous, soundbite or whatever video clip that's going to play and make us appear, just as bad as the other side.
Well, I think the way to approach an Antifa person is the same basic model that we would use to approach anyone, especially someone we have a disagreement with, is first of all, as the search for search for common ground always used to say, find the commonalities and work on the differences. So the first thing I would say if I had a conversation with an Antifa person is, I really appreciate your response to fascism. I resonate with that. We need that. But I think I can show you a better way, which is what Gandhi always said. He said, if you're not ready to be a conscientious objector, go ahead and use violence, but I can show you a better way, which would be more dignified for you and much more effective, especially in the long run. And in those situations where we need to rely on violent people for our protection, because we hadn't done anything, we hadn't prepared anything better, I'm not going to say, don't rely on them, go get yourself killed. But I'm going to say a lot depends on how you come out of it. There's two very different paths, speaking of attitudes, that you can take. One is, this shows me that I must have violence all around me to protect me whenever I'm in the situation. The other path is to say, this shows me I wasn't prepared. Next time, I want to be prepared with nonviolence. I'm remembering an episode where I had a military person talking in my nonviolence class, and the subject of peace teams came up, and he said, "Thus, peace teams is a nice idea, but would you please have a rifle brigade behind you to protect you?" And I was ready to split. I didn't know what I would say, but I had a student, God bless Casey, his whole family was Air Force, and he just quietly raised his hand and he said, "No, sir, I think nonviolence is its own protection." And you can also prove that statistically. And so my military friend was absolutely stunned. I think that was a very good response that we could have gone further with, but he wasn't interested in talking to us anymore. But in worst case, if somebody attacks me or somebody else and I have to use harmful force to defend myself or them, okay, I'm going to use it, but I'm not going to go around saying, well, this shows I should always carry a 9mm. I'm going to go out saying, this shows that somewhere my nonviolence was not strong enough.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
This has just been such an honor to have you and to be on this call with everyone. There's been some great questions. I appreciate everyone who's been on. And thank you, Ryan. Thank you, of course, Michael. You're brilliant. David Hartsoe, Dr. Vicki Riddell, E. Kidsley, Gil Burrows, Jane Baker, Linda O'Hara Scott, Mary Dinau. I'm not all that good. Miles Clegg, Pamela Kemp, Rivera Sun, Sarah Koopman, Sherry Morin, Stephanie Doak Kent, Veronica Pellicrook. And then there's some names there's some numbers that I don't have names, but I want to thank everybody for being on this call. This has just been such a treat and such an honor, and I've learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Appreciate it. Have a great evening. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome, Ryan. Sarah, are you going to be at the PJSA?